Okay, here to preview this Bucks series, we've got Eric Name of The Athletic. Eric, how's it going, man?
It's great. I'm excited for playoff basketball. I had to wait a week to actually be like a part of like the fun. So I'm excited that it's finally here.
The Bucks are facing the Heat in the first round this year. Last time this happened, the Bucks swept the Heat and won their first NBA championship since 1971. Is there any reason to think that this series will not be a sweep this time around?
So, oh man, I think over the years, Eric Spoelstra has defended Giannis better than anybody else. And I shouldn't say that like, oh, if you just have Eric Spoelstra, you're gonna have a great defense against Giannis. Like,
Yeah.
obviously, it's a sprint scheme and they know what they're doing, but also that means the Heat have had a lot of good defenders over the year. They've had size on the wing, they've had big rim protectors. They've been able to kind of build the wall, build it strongly, make sure that they're disciplined and sound in their kind of schemes against Giannis. And that's always the big thing is do you have a plan against Giannis? And I would say the Heat have a plan. Now, this team compared to other versions of this Heat roster, maybe not as much size. Like they just don't have
Mm-hmm.
the type of guys that can really, take on the first bump against Giannis. Like we're talking about, when they eliminated the Bucks from the bubble, Jay Crowder was covering Giannis. Jay Crowder is now a Buck. So they just I don't think have enough size. I think the Bucks are gonna be very confident against this Heat team. I think they kind of cracked the code in 2021 when it was like, all right, we're just gonna put Giannis on Jimmy Butler, and we're going to put Brook Lopez on Bam Adebayo, and we're going to play under on everything and dare those two guys to shoot as many threes as they want, shoot as many
Yep.
mid-range jumpers as they want. And if you do it and beat them, great. But neither of those guys showed the capability to do that with that type of size on them. With Brook Lopez on Bam, with Giannis on Jimmy Butler, they just couldn't really do it. So I don't think there's a ton of fear, but I do think when you're looking at the Heat and like potential matchups, the reason why I rank them as the least favorable option for the Bucks of the four teams that were in the play-in tournament in the East is it's gonna be a pain in the ass. Like the Heat are that's just who the Heat tend to be. Granted, there's been some bad moments during the play-in tournament for the Heat where they didn't look quite like the Heat of old, but I do think overall this is a Bucks team that'll be very confident against the Heat.
So one of the big questions for the Bucks is the status of Chris Middleton. Only played 8 games in his last game after re-aggravating his knee, and then he sat out the final 2 games of the season. Based on what you saw this season in those 33 games he played, what are your expectations for him in these playoffs? Do you feel like he was getting closer to regaining his form as the season went on?
So this is a question that Mike Budenholzer has taken from me. I don't know how many times at this point, but I'm very much of the belief that there is a difference between playing 35 regular season minutes and playing 35 playoff minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And one of those is going to be harder, and it's going to be the playoffs, and you're going to have to play through more contact. You're going to have more schemes up against you. And like that doesn't even touch the fact that when the Bucks went on their championship run, the games that they needed to win, Chris Middleton was playing 45 of the 80 of the 48 minutes. Like
Yeah.
he he's one of the guys that gets the playoff bump, right? He's one of the three most important players. He's the one that you never take off the floor with Giannis and Drew Holiday. That's kind of how you win tight playoff games. That is to me a massive gap to go from 35 regular season minutes to 45 playoff minutes. Like the gulf between it's just 10 minutes. I understand that. But the gulf between playoffs, regular season, and then those 10 minutes specifically, I think it's massive. And I think it's going to be a big question for the Bucks throughout this postseason. And Chris looked good at times. I think throughout this year, there's definitely moments where you're like, okay, yeah, that's Chris Middleton. Like he is back. He's doing his thing. He's able to move the way that he needs to. But there's also been times where it's like, yeah, Chris isn't quite right. So I think it's going to be a big question. I think the Bucks over this year have kind of gotten better at dealing with not having Chris around. Last year was a real problem, right? They had Chris the whole year. All of a sudden he goes down in the playoffs, and they just didn't have enough size on the wing against the Celtics because they didn't have a guy like Jay Crowder that they could throw in there. And then they just didn't have enough scoring. They weren't prepared for it. They didn't know what to do offensively. And I think one of the big storylines of the season has been how good Drew Holiday is offensively. He's just been fantastic for them this season. I don't know if I don't think he's going to get all NBA third team because guard is just loaded. But he had to be in those conversations. Like for people filling out their ballots, I had multiple people ask me like, hey, do you think Drew is worthy of that? And every time I said yes. Like to me, he's just been fantastic. The usage is up, the scoring's better. To me, he's just put together this great season. And a big part of it was Chris isn't here. Someone's got to, pick up the slack, and it ended up being Drew Holiday.
So you mentioned Jay Crowder. I wanted to ask you about him because he's entering the playoffs after only having played 18 games with this Bucks team. Do you feel like he has fully acclimated to his role on this team yet?
So I think this is a really difficult question because I was there in 2021 when the Bucks won a championship, and everyone remembers the Bucks traded for PJ Tucker. PJ Tucker transformed their defense, their toughness, all that stuff. PJ Tucker barely played once he got traded to Milwaukee. They sat him out forever because he had a bad calf. When the playoffs started, he was not in the starting lineup. He was not playing a massive role. Dante DiVincenzo was. Dante did that. And then Dante got hurt. And then they brought in PJ, and PJ took on a bigger role. So if you would have asked me before the 2021 playoffs, is PJ Tucker ready for a large role in the postseason? I would have said, probably not. He'll come off the bench. He'll do his thing. And because of that, I don't know that I can say Jay Crowder isn't ready for it, or Jay Crowder hasn't played enough, or Jay Crowder hasn't found enough rhythm, because vets like that, especially when they're asked to hit corner threes and defend hard and physically, they tend to be able to find their rhythm and tend to be able to just kind of pick up where they've left off in the past when, Jay Crowder was in the NBA finals against the Milwaukee Bucks. Like those types of guys tend to be able to pick up that level. But I do think it is a question. I think he was ramping up nicely. I think he was in a spot where they were feeling good about it. And then he had some calf soreness, had to sit out for 5 games. And then it kind of felt like the ramp was going up, and then it had to go down for a little bit, and now it's going back up. So Jay's very confident. I think the team's very confident in him and his ability and what he's going to be able to do. But I think with him and with a lot of this team, that's the major question is, are they going to be ready for the playoffs when it comes around?
So Bud was pretty consistent with just playing 8 guys last year in the playoffs. This team is a little deeper, though, with Jay Crowder and Joe Ingles. How do you think Bud handles the rotations this playoffs?
Bud's getting annoyed with me asking that question as well. Because it's just clear, right? Like I think being a deep regular season team is good. That is how you put up 58 wins. That is how you put up, 60 wins the other year when the Bucks did that. Like that's how you have regular season success. Guys go out for a couple weeks. You have more guys that can fill in and do the thing. But it doesn't matter if you're 12 deep in the playoffs. It doesn't matter. You're not playing that many dudes. You're going to play 8, and when it really matters, you're going to play 7. So you have to make sure that those 7 and 8 are as good as possible. And I do think they have some really serious questions. When the Bucks played the Celtics and the Sixers back-to-back about 2 weeks ago, Pat Connaughton was not in the rotation. He was out. They had decided that it was going to be Jay Crowder, it was going to be Joe Ingles, it was going to be Wesley Matthews, it was going to be Grayson Allen. Those are going to be the 4 guys on the wing. And they got used different amounts in those 2 games, but those are going to be the guys. Pat Connaughton was on the outside looking in. As I've told Bucks fans, Pat Connaughton, I believe, is the only Buck of the modern era to receive a Mike Breen bang. Like, that's the type of clutch shot maker.
Yeah.
In the end, like, he had big moments in the finals. Like, that is a guy that you can 100% trust in the playoffs. And that's not to say Joe Ingles isn't. And that's not to say Jay Crowder isn't, or Grayson Allen. That isn't to say anything bad about those guys. But I know Pat Connaughton is. And right now, Pat Connaughton's on the outside looking in because he has struggled to shoot this season. He's down He was flirting with 40% last year. Now it's like 34%. He hasn't been shooting the ball well. So I understand it, but ultimately you're going to get into the spot where you got to pick your 8 guys for that series, and you have enough vets that, one of those guys is going to be on the outside looking in. And when you talk to people around the team, I do think there's a level of belief that, one, if you're a guy like Pat Connaughton or Bobby Portis that already has a championship and signed up to remain in Milwaukee, you know what the deal is. You know that, as Bobby Portis did, he sat out the whole Nets series, and then he came in and had a big NBA Finals. He was great in the Eastern Conference Finals. Pat Connaughton plays a lot in one series, doesn't play as much in another. Those guys signed up for that. And then the guys that have been added, Jay Crowder, Joe Ingles, Grayson Allen, Javon Carter, all those dudes don't have rings, and they want one. So I think there's a belief internally that everyone knows what the end goal is. In some series I might play, in some series I might not, but that shit is a lot easier to say before you're in it and sitting on the bench. And I think that's really where it's going to get interesting, because I agree they probably have about 10 rotation guys, and there's going to need to be some cuts made, and some series might work better for other guys than it does for, some regulars or whatever it might be. So I think it's going to be fascinating to watch as the Bucks try to figure this out.
So you wrote a really interesting article this week about how Coach Bud uses timeouts, and specifically how he uses a timeout just before the 3-minute mark of the fourth quarter. For listeners who might not know, could you explain the significance of the 3-minute mark, and then what makes the Bucks unique when it comes to calling a timeout at that point?
Sure. This is many people have referred to this as some real sicko shit. That does tend to be the kind of basketball stuff that I'm into. So essentially in the NBA rule book, 74 pages long, there's a section on timing and scoring. And in that, there's a rule with a subsection and another subsection that tells you that in the final 3 minutes of a basketball game, you can only take 2 timeouts. So if you have 4 timeouts left, if you have 3 timeouts left, whatever, as soon as it hits the 3-minute mark, you have 2. That's it. There's no, I saved them and now I can take 5 timeouts in the final 3 minutes. No. Once it hits 3 minutes, you get 2. And that means there's always the option for coaches. And I shouldn't say always. Sometimes coaches use them more regularly, but a lot of coaches have the option of either using that timeout or losing that timeout, just watching it disappear into thin air because they decided not to call it. And over the years, I realized that Mike Budenholzer calls this timeout a lot. So I asked my friend Seth Partnow, like, hey, can you run some numbers and see if he actually calls this as much as I think he does? And the numbers confirmed it. Bud calls that timeout more than any other coach in the league. No one calls more timeouts in the 40 minute of the game than Mike Budenholzer. And once I had the numbers, I went to Bud, and honestly, I knew I thought it was going to be like a fun, nerdy, like 1,000-word, like throwaway story, right? Because this is some real nerd stuff. But what ended up happening was, like Bud was telling me, oh yeah, and in the final minute, I don't like to play with the timeout. I'd rather let the guys play. And like he tells me about this jump shot that Avery Johnson hit in 1998 in the Alamo Dome. And this is like a fundamental part of why he coaches the way that he does. And then, he was like, oh, you should talk to Patrick St. Andrews, who runs our game card, and tells me, like he gets all the plays ready to go that we might use in that game. And we run through and shoot around. And like, it just, to me, I love the nerdy stuff. I love really going in there, but it was fun to find something so specific and so like just nerdy, and then kind of find out that if you really dig deep in there, you learn a lot about kind of how Mike Budenholzer thinks about the game, how he thinks about end of game situations, what he's trying to do. And honestly, I kind of found a greater understanding of what they are trying to do. So hopefully if people read it, they can do that as well.
Yeah, there's a detail in there that I just never knew, which is that if your player is dribbling up the court with the intention to call a timeout once they cross half court, it benefits you to have them call that timeout at the top of the key, because it allows you to take the ball out on either side of the court, which I just never knew. And in the article, you talk about the relative success of the Bucks in these after timeout situations over the last couple of seasons. I was wondering, do you know if that success has carried over to the playoffs in those after timeout situations?
Yeah, so overall they've been very good, but so like the main problem with timeouts overall as an offense is that you're giving the defense a chance to set up. And what makes efficient offense is, like the freedom, the creativity, the pace, going off of turnovers, whatever it may be. So offense is always worse coming out of a timeout. Like whatever the Bucks' normal offensive efficiency is not it's going to be better than whatever it is out of a timeout. So I believe, and again, I would have to recheck these numbers, but I believe in the playoffs, that becomes even more dramatic, like where defenses like really lock
Yeah.
it. It's not just like, okay, yeah, whatever, it's a timeout on a Tuesday in March. No, this is the NBA playoffs, man. Like we are really going to lock in. So the Bucks' relative success remains the same, but overall, like calling timeouts just brings offense down, which is why I wanted to like ask, right? Because
Yeah.
Bud knows that letting your offense play through works well because he does it in the final minute of games.
Mhm.
So why didn't he want to do it with 3 minutes like that? Putting the puzzle pieces together in my brain was like a fun thing. But no, I did not know the thing about dribbling to the middle of the floor so you could call a sideline out of bounds play on either side. I had no idea that was a thing.
Yeah. That's so funny. That's cool. Yeah, go check out Eric's piece. That's really interesting stuff. So looking ahead, if the Bucks win their first round series, they'll face the winner of Cleveland, New York. Do Bucks fans have a clear preference for their second round matchup? And is there one team that's a better matchup for Milwaukee?
I think the Bucks' only preference was not being someone that had to play the Celtics or the Sixers in the second round.
Yeah,
That
for real.
was all they cared about. And the easiest way to do that was obviously to be the number one seed and make those two teams potentially, we'll see how, series shake out, but those two teams should essentially play in the second round in the 2-3 matchup. So that was really Bucks fans' only preference was don't play either of those two teams. Don't make it a situation where you have to beat the Sixers in the second round and the Celtics in the Eastern Conference Finals. Make it so that you only have to face one of those teams, and they were successful in that regard. As far as between those two teams, I tend to think that the Cavaliers defend Giannis particularly well. They have the large bodies, they have a lot of the things when you put it all together that can make Giannis struggle over the years. And, last year, essentially what Giannis said was like, after a Cavs game, he's like, their defense reminds me a lot of like Toronto and Miami. And I like, he said it and I just like stopped and I was like, those are the only two teams that have beat him in the playoffs when he's been a superstar. So, yeah, that might be notable. Like that might be something that, he's thinking about in his head. So I think that makes the Knicks a little bit easier matchup just because I don't think they have the people to defend Giannis. It's not something that they've really been able to do. But overall, I think there's a lot of confidence from Bucks fans that whether it's the Knicks, whether it's the Cavaliers, that's a series that they can win in the second round and get themselves to the Eastern Conference Finals to face the winner of the Sixers and the Celtics.
Okay, it's prediction time. What's your final prediction for Bucks Heat?
I think it's probably a gentleman's sweep. I think the Bucks probably get that done in 5. This is a team that they have a lot of confidence against, even though the Heat are absolutely going to be a pain. And really, they have some guys that can be physical with Giannis, and Eric Spoelstra is someone that is not afraid of getting his guys to do that. So in my mind, I think maybe there's a game in there where, the Bucks don't play well. Maybe it's the first game since they haven't played in 2 weeks and aren't going to have any rhythm. But I think overall that's a team that they really feel confident against. I think that sweep in 2021 has kind of, for a while, it was kind of like the boogeyman going to see the Heat in Miami and, oh my gosh, Eric Spoelstra. And then they stomped them. And then after that, I was just like, nah, we're good. Like, we're better than this team. They don't have anything for us. And I think we've seen a big change in their confidence since then.
Go check out all of Eric's work at The Athletic. Eric, thanks so much for coming on.